A German SS general walked into an American command post in the spring of 1945. His boots were polished. His medals were in place. He raised his arm in a salute and waited. The American soldier at the desk did not look up. He kept writing. The German waited 30 seconds, a minute. The American turned a page. The German's arm was still in the air. And in that silence, that deliberate, crushing silence, the entire Nazi empire finally ended. Not with a battle, not with a bomb, with a young man from Ohio who simply did not care. Reims, France, 2:41 in the morning, May 7th, 1945. The room was small, plain, and deliberately ordinary. A single long table, a few overhead lights, maps pinned to the walls. The kind of room where supply sergeants processed requisition forms, not where history was supposed to be made, but history was being made anyway. A German general named Alfred Jodl sat down at that table. He was 54 years old, lean, sharp-featured, with the cold and measured bearing of a man who had spent his entire life giving orders and expecting them to be followed without question. His uniform was pressed. His posture was perfect. Even now, in the final hours of a catastrophic defeat, he carried himself with the rigid discipline of man who believed that dignity was something you maintained regardless of circumstances. He picked up the pen. He signed the document that surrendered Nazi Germany unconditionally to the Allied forces, and the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the most powerful military figure in the Western world, the man who had organized and executed the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the man whose signature had sent millions of soldiers into battle across 2 continents, was not in the room. He was not at the table. He was not even in the hallway. Eisenhower was in a private office down the corridor, alone, waiting for it to be over. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what Jodl expected, what every senior German officer expected, what they had been expecting since the moment it became clear that Germany was going to lose this war. They expected to be treated like generals. For centuries, European warfare operated on an unspoken agreement between the men who commanded armies. You fought, you bled, you inflicted and absorbed tremendous suffering, and when it was finally over, when one side had clearly won and the other had clearly lost, the officers on both sides extended to each other a kind of professional respect that existed completely separately from the horror of what they had just done. The defeated general surrendered his sword. The victorious general accepted it with a nod. They sat across from each other. They talked. They acknowledged one another as men who had played the same brutal game, just on opposite sides of the board. It was not mercy. It was not kindness. It was theater, but it was theater that served a purpose. It told soldiers on both sides that even at the end of everything, there were rules, that even in the business of organized killing, certain boundaries held. This tradition was not ancient history by 1945. It had been alive and practiced just 2 years earlier in the burning desert sands of North Africa between British and American commanders and a German general named Erwin Rommel. Rommel was the enemy. He was brilliant, relentless, and dangerous. His Africa Corps had pushed Allied forces to the edge of collapse across thousands of miles of scorching desert. He had outmaneuvered, outfought, and humiliated Allied commanders repeatedly. British soldiers were terrified of him, and yet even as they feared him, they respected him. British officers described him in dispatch not as a monster, but as a formidable professional. American commanders studied his tactics with genuine admiration. When Allied forces finally gained the upper hand in North Africa, there was a shared understanding in the senior ranks that the opposing German officers, whatever their politics, were soldiers in the traditional sense. That understanding shaped the expectation that every German general carried into 1945. They had fought hard. They had lost. Now would come the ceremony of defeat, and they would be treated accordingly. Alfred Jodl believed this. The SS commanders believed this. The Wehrmacht generals who lined up at American checkpoints believed this. They had spent their careers inside a military culture built on hierarchy, ceremony, and the belief that rank conferred a kind of permanent dignity that even defeat could not erase. They were wrong, and the first man to show them how wrong they were was not the Eisenhower they would meet at Reims in May of 1945. It was the Eisenhower who stood in a dusty tent in North Africa in May of 1943. His name was Jürgen von Arnim. He was 53 years old, a career soldier, a general who had commanded German forces in Tunisia through the brutal final months of the North African campaign. When the Axis position in Tunisia finally collapsed, over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in what became one of the largest capitulations of the entire war. Von Arnim was among them. He was captured, processed, and prepared to be brought before General Eisenhower. This was standard procedure. This was how it was done. The senior captured commander was presented to the senior Allied commander. They met. They exchanged the formalities that the occasion demanded. Von Arnim expected this. His staff expected this. Everyone involved expected this. Eisenhower refused. He did not yell about it. He did not make a speech. He simply told his aide, quietly and without apparent emotion, that he would not be meeting with General von Arnim. He instructed them to process the German general as a prisoner of war and see to his proper confinement. Nothing more. Von Arnim was furious. His aides were stunned. Even some American officers were uncomfortable. It felt irregular. It felt, to many of them, unprofessional. There were murmurs in the senior staff that Eisenhower was letting emotion override protocol, that he was breaking with a tradition that existed for important reasons. Eisenhower did not explain himself. He did not point to a document or cite a regulation. He did not call a press conference or issue a statement. He simply made his decision and moved on, leaving behind a question that his own officers quietly debated but never fully resolved. Why? What had von Arnim done that placed him outside the circle of professional courtesy that had been extended to Rommel and others? What was the line that Eisenhower had drawn, and what had placed the German general on the wrong side of it? The answer would not come in North Africa. It would not come in France after D-Day or in the brutal winter fighting across Belgium and Luxembourg. It would come on a cold April morning in 1945 in a place in central Germany that almost no one outside the region had ever heard of, a place called Ohrdruf. But before that morning arrived, the German High Command was busy preparing for a different kind of ending. In the final weeks and months of the war, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east and American and British forces pushed in from the west, the Nazi military elite began making calculations. Germany was finished. That was obvious. The only question was the terms of what came next. And the terms, they believed, would be negotiated between equals. These were men who had spent 12 years at the absolute center of power in one of the most militarized states in modern history. They had stood on the balconies of captured capitals. They had held the authority of life and death over millions of people. They had been saluted everywhere they walked, feared in every room they entered, and obeyed without question or hesitation by everyone beneath them. Their rank was not simply a job title, it was their identity. It was the foundation of how they understood themselves and their place in the world. The uniform was not clothing, it was armor. As long as they wore it, as long as the medals hung from their chests and the insignia gleamed on their collars, they were someone. They were untouchable. They drove toward American lines in Mercedes staff cars. They brought multiple suitcases packed with tailored uniforms, bottles of expensive wine, and in some cases, artwork that had been systematically looted from across occupied Europe. They brought junior officers to serve as personal aides. They arrived at checkpoints and demanded, not requested, to be taken immediately to the highest-ranking American officer present. They expected to be escorted to clean private quarters. They expected formal written acknowledgments of their status. They expected the Americans to stand at attention. They expected everything they had always received. What they were about to receive instead had been set in motion by an order that Eisenhower had not yet publicly issued, shaped by a decision that was still forming in the mind of a quiet, calculating man from Abilene, Kansas, who was at that very moment driving toward a set of barbed wire fences in central Germany. The war in Europe had less than a month left, and Dwight Eisenhower was about to see something that would permanently end whatever remained of his willingness to treat the men in black uniforms as soldiers. April 12, 1945. The convoy moved through the German countryside in the early morning light, jeeps and staff cars rolling along roads that had been fought over and bled on for months. The trees were beginning to green. Birds were moving in the hedgerows. Spring was arriving in central Germany, the way it always arrived, indifferent to everything that human beings had done to each other across the long, brutal winter. Eisenhower sat in the back of his staff car. He had received the reports the previous day. His commanders had found something inside a place called Ohrdruf, a sub-camp attached to the larger Buchenwald concentration camp system. The reports were disturbing enough that Eisenhower had decided he needed to go himself. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Patton was already there waiting. Omar Bradley rode in a separate vehicle. The three of them, the senior American commanders in the European theater, converged on that place together. Three men who had seen more of war than almost anyone alive. Three men who believed, after years of combat across two continents, that there was very little left that could genuinely shock them. They were wrong about that, too. The gates opened. What was inside defied the language that soldiers use to describe difficult things. There is a vocabulary that combat veterans develop over years of service, a kind of compressed, practical shorthand for horror that lets men process what they have seen and keep moving. Eisenhower had that vocabulary. Patton had it. Bradley had it. None of it was adequate for Ohrdruf. The camp was littered with bodies. Not the bodies of soldiers killed in combat, which have their own terrible grammar of violence. These were not soldiers. Men, prisoners, slave laborers, the discarded remnants of a system that had worked them until there was nothing left, reduced to the dimensions of skeletons. Their skin stretched over bones like parchment over wire. They lay in the open air where they had fallen or been thrown, rotting in the spring sun. The smell hit the American officers before they had walked 20 feet. The survivors who moved toward the Americans looked like something that existed between the living and the dead. Their eyes were present but emptied of everything that makes a human face readable. Disease had done things to their bodies that medicine had no clean words for. They reached out with hands that were barely hands anymore. Patton, George S. Patton, the man who had slapped a hospitalized soldier for crying, the man who carried ivory-handled revolvers and quoted Napoleon from memory, the man whose entire public identity was built on the performance of absolute fearlessness, walked behind a building and vomited. He came back. He stood straight. He put his face back into the expression of a general. But he had gone behind that building, and everyone present knew it, and no one said a word about it. Bradley stood completely still. His face went the color of old ash. He looked at what was in front of him with the expression of a man whose mind is working very hard to process something it was not built to process. Eisenhower did not look away. This is the detail that separates what happened to Eisenhower at Ohrdruf from what happened to the other two men. Patton was broken by it in one way. Bradley was broken by it in another. Eisenhower was not broken. He was transformed. He walked through every part of that camp, deliberately, methodically, the execution shed, the torture implements that had been left exactly where they were used, the ditches, the faces of the dead. He looked at all of it with a jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face stood out like cables under tension. He was burning it in. He was making himself remember every detail with the same cold precision he brought to planning an invasion or reading a logistics report. Because somewhere behind those pale eyes, a calculation was already being made. A conclusion was already forming, and it was a conclusion that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy or the mechanics of winning a war that was already won. He turned to the American soldiers standing nearby, the GIs, who had liberated this place and had been living with what they found inside it for days. He told them to get their cameras. He ordered them to photograph everything, every body, every ditch, every face, every instrument used to reduce human beings to this. His voice was steady, quiet. The trembling was not in his voice. It was somewhere much deeper and much colder. Get it all on record, he told them. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened. He meant it as a practical instruction. A commander thinking about evidence and documentation and the historical record. But it was also something more than that. It was the statement of a man who had just looked into the face of a specific and organized evil and understood fully and finally exactly what that evil was and exactly who had built it. He drove back to his headquarters that night and wrote a letter to his wife, Mamie. The letter described what he had seen in language so plain and so controlled that it is almost more disturbing than if he had written it in grief. He was not performing composure for his staff or subordinates. He was alone, writing to the person he trusted most. And even then, the composure held, because the emotion had not gone somewhere soft. It had gone somewhere hard, somewhere permanent. That night, that letter, that walk through Ohrdruf, that was the answer to the question that had been hanging in the air since North Africa in 1943. That was why Eisenhower had refused to meet von Arnim in the desert, not because of a regulation, not because of protocol, but because Eisenhower had already understood something in 1943 that he could not fully articulate, something he had sensed in the files and the reports and the intelligence that crossed his desk, and that Ohrdruf had now burned into him with a finality that left no room for doubt. The men in the black uniforms were not soldiers. They were the administrators of a slaughter factory. They were the architects and the operators and the enthusiastic participants in a system designed with industrial precision to murder human beings on a scale that had no precedent in recorded history. The medals on their chests, the polish on their boots, the crisp lines of their uniforms, all of it was costuming. It was the aesthetic of authority draped over something that had no business calling itself military. In the days that followed, the directive took shape. It was not a dramatic announcement. Eisenhower did not call a press conference. He did not deliver a speech. He issued an order through his command structure, the way orders were issued, clearly and without excessive explanation. The substance of it was simple enough to fit in a single sentence. American soldiers would not return the salutes of SS officers and senior Nazi officials, not as a single type directive with a file number and a date stamp, but as a policy that moved through the command structure the way the most important orders often do, through example, through tone, through the unspoken understanding that flows downward from the way a supreme commander conducts himself in front of his men. There would be no handshakes, no fraternization, no friendly exchange of any kind. If a captured SS general walked into an American command post and raised his arm in salute, the American soldiers were to look through him as if he were not there. If he demanded to speak to a commander, they were to turn their backs. If he demanded special food, they were to hand him standard prison rations. If he demanded private quarters, they were to put him in a crowded pen with everyone else. The order moved through the command structure and reached the ears of every American soldier, from the most senior general down to the youngest private standing checkpoint duty on a dirt road in Bavaria. And then came the moment that some of those officers had been quietly worried about, because Patton received the order too. George Patton's relationship with military tradition was not a casual one. He was in many genuine ways the last of a certain kind of officer, a man who believed with absolute sincerity in the romance of the warrior, in the unbroken lineage of soldiers stretching back through Napoleon and Caesar to the armies of ancient Greece. He wore his rank like a medieval knight wore armor. The ceremony of military life was not theater to Patton. It was religion. There were officers in Eisenhower's staff who expected Patton to push back. He did not push back. He agreed immediately, completely, and without qualification. The man who had spent his career defending military tradition as a sacred inheritance agreed without hesitation to a policy that broke with one of that tradition's oldest customs. Ohrdruf had reached him too. It had reached him in a different way, through the stomach rather than through the eyes. But it had reached him. What happened next, however, is the part of this story that does not fit cleanly into the version where Patton is simply the blunt instrument of justice. By September of 1945, 4 months after Germany's surrender, Patton had been appointed military governor of Bavaria, and in that role he began making practical arguments for retaining former Nazi Party members in administrative positions. Germany's government had to function somehow, he reasoned. The only people who knew how to run it were the people who had been running it. Ideology was a problem for politicians. He was a soldier. He needed administrators. He said this publicly. He said it in ways that Eisenhower could not ignore or contain. Eisenhower removed him from command. The man who had agreed without hesitation to deny a salute to an SS general in April was, by September, arguing for the practical reintegration of the system that General had represented. Not out of sympathy for what that system had done, but out of the soldier's ancient habit of subordinating moral complexity to operational necessity. Patton died in December of 1945 in a hospital in Heidelberg 12 days after a car accident on a road outside Mannheim. He never faced the political and historical reckoning that his September statements might eventually have required. History froze him at his most heroic moment and let the complicated September version quietly recede. Eisenhower did not forget it, but in the spring of 1945, all of that was still months away. In the spring of 1945, the directive was in effect, and the men in black uniforms were arriving. They came in waves, hundreds of them, then thousands. SS commanders and Wehrmacht generals and high-ranking Nazi officials of every variety, flowing into American prisoner of war facilities across Germany and Austria as the Reich dissolved around them. They came in their staff cars and their tailored uniforms, with their suitcases and their aids and their absolute unshakable confidence that the world they had inhabited for 12 years still had some operational reality. It did not. Among those who arrived was Admiral Hans Georg von Friedeburg, 53 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, following Dönitz's elevation to the German presidency on April 30th, 1945, in Hitler's final political gesture. Cold, formal, precise, a man whose bearing communicated, even in surrender, that he considered himself several grades above the circumstances he currently found himself in. Von Friedeburg had been part of the German delegation in earlier surrender negotiations. He had sat across tables from Allied officers in the final days of the war, and he had conducted himself throughout with the remote dignity of a man attending a formal function he found mildly beneath his station. He arrived expecting Reims to be the same. He arrived expecting ceremony. What he found in the rooms and corridors of Allied command posts was something he had no framework to process. The American soldiers, the enlisted men, the young men from Ohio and Georgia and Brooklyn and Texas who staffed the checkpoints and guard posts and processing desks looked at him and did not react. They did not snap to attention. They did not lower their eyes respectfully. They did not step aside with the deferential body language that everyone with authority had produced automatically around a man of von Friedeburg's rank for as long as he could remember. They looked at him the way you look at a piece of furniture in a room you have walked through 100 times. They looked through him. This is the detail that the history books sometimes miss when they describe the psychological impact of Eisenhower's directive. It was not the anger that destroyed these men. The German generals could have processed anger. Anger was a response. Anger acknowledged that you existed, that you were significant enough to provoke a reaction. The silence was something different. The silence said that the uniform meant nothing. The medals meant nothing. The rank, the career, the identity that had been constructed over decades inside the most militarized state in modern history meant nothing. The young American standing at the checkpoint with dirt under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes and memories of what he had seen inside the concentration camps burning somewhere behind his expression was not performing contempt. He was not making a statement. He simply did not care. That was the weapon, not hatred, not vengeance, not even the cold, deliberate insult of a policy decision enacted from above. Just a flat, complete, total indifference of men who had seen enough to know exactly what the uniform represented and who had concluded, without drama and without ceremony, that it represented nothing worth acknowledging. Reims, May 7th, 1945, 2:41 in the morning. Alfred Jodl sat at the table and picked up the pen. His hands were steady. His face was composed. To look at him was to see a man maintaining form even as everything the form was built on had ceased to exist. He signed. The war in Europe was over. Von Friedeburg signed beside him. They were brought down a corridor to a private office. The room was cold. Eisenhower stood behind his desk. He did not smile. He did not extend his hand. He did not gesture toward a chair. He looked at the two men who had just formally surrendered the Third Reich with eyes that communicated exactly one thing. He asked them one question. Did they understand the terms of the surrender, and were they prepared to execute them? They said yes. Eisenhower nodded once toward the door. The guards stepped forward. The meeting lasted less than 60 seconds. There was no ceremony. There was no historic handshake. There was no photograph of opposing commanders acknowledging each other across the table of shared sacrifice. There was a desk, a cold room, one question, and a door. Jodl walked back out in the corridor a different kind of defeated than he had been when he walked in. He had expected to exit that office as a general who had lost a war. He exited it as something smaller than that. Something that did not yet have a name, but that he would spend the remaining months of his life trying to understand. He would not have much time. The court at Nuremberg was already being assembled, and von Friedeburg, precise and formal and cold to the last, would not wait for Nuremberg. He would be dead within 16 days by his own hand, unwilling or unable to inhabit a world in which the identity he had built his entire existence around had been reduced in the space of a 60-second meeting in a cold room in Reims to precisely nothing. The spring of 1945 was ending. The reckoning was just beginning. And the most uncomfortable chapter of this story, the chapter that complicates everything, that refuses to allow the ending to be clean, was still waiting quietly in the future, 2 years away, in a set of classified directives and secret arrangements that would carry a name most Americans had never heard. Paperclip, Nuremberg, October 16, 1946. It was just past 1 in the morning when they came for Alfred Jodl. He had been in custody for 17 months. 17 months of hearings, testimony, documents, and the slow, methodical process of a court trying to construct legal language adequate to crimes that had no real legal precedent. He had sat through it with the same composure he had carried into that cold room in Reims. Upright, controlled, the bearing of a man who still believed, somewhere beneath the surface, that his identity as a soldier gave him a dignity that the proceedings around him could not fully dissolve. The court did not agree. He was convicted on all 4 counts: war crimes, crimes against humanity, conspiracy to wage aggressive war. The judges had read the documents. They had heard the testimony. They had looked at the evidence of what the military machine that Jodl helped operate had done across the continent, and they had reached a conclusion that required no particular elaboration. He was sentenced to death by hanging. In his final statement, Jodl said that he was dying with a clear conscience for his service to the German people. He said it the way a man says something he has decided to believe, because the alternative is to spend his last hours facing something he cannot face. The gallows were inside the Nuremberg prison gymnasium. It took less than 2 minutes. The man who had sat across from Eisenhower's empty chair at Reims, who had signed the documents that ended the bloodiest war in human history, who had walked into that cold office expecting the deference owed to a defeated commander and received instead 60 seconds and a nod toward the door, was gone. History had rendered its verdict. Law had executed it. 8 years later, a German court would partially revisit that verdict, a reminder that even Nuremberg's conclusions were not immune to the passage of time and the shifting of political winds. But law, as it turned out, was not the only force operating on the wreckage of the Third Reich. Hans-Georg von Friedeburg did not wait for Nuremberg. He had known in the days immediately following the surrender that there would be investigations, that there would be questions, that the cold, precise administrative life he had lived inside the German Navy would be examined in detail by people with documents and time, and the particular relentlessness of men conducting a legal process rather than a military one. He did not want to be examined. On May 23, 1945, 16 days after signing the surrender at Reims, von Friedeburg took poison in the German town of Flensburg, near the Danish border, where the remnants of the German government had gathered in the final days of the collapse. He was 53 years old. He died with his uniform on. There is something in that detail that resists easy interpretation. The man who had maintained form through everything, through defeat and surrender, and the 60-second dismissal in Reims, maintained it to the end. Whether that was courage or cowardice, or simply the only way a man of his particular construction knew how to exit the stage, it is impossible to say with certainty. What can be said is that he made his choice before anyone could make it for him. He had spent his life operating inside a structure that told him who he was. When that structure ceased to exist, when the uniform became a costume and the rank became a label without meaning, and the cold room in Reims had reduced his life's work to 60 seconds and a closed door, he appears to have concluded that there was nothing left on the other side worth inhabiting. 16 days, that was all the time he needed to make that calculation. George Patton made a different calculation. Patton survived the war. He was in Germany in the summer and fall of 1945, serving as military governor of Bavaria, managing the enormous and chaotic task of administering a defeated nation while simultaneously trying to contain the political complexity of an emerging new world order that was already beginning to take the shape of what would become the Cold War. He was not a political man. He was, at his core and by his own repeated insistence, a soldier. And soldiers, in Patton's understanding of the world, dealt with practical realities. They did not have the luxury of sustained moral purity when operational necessity pushed back. The operational necessity, as he saw it in Bavaria in the fall of 1945, was this: Germany had to function. There had to be administrators who knew how to run the schools and the courts and the water systems and the local governments. The country was in ruins. The people were starving. And the only people who actually knew how to operate the administrative machinery were, in many cases, the people who had been operating it for the previous 12 years under the Nazi government. Patton began retaining former Nazi Party members in administrative positions. He said publicly that he saw little difference between Nazi Party membership and membership in a political party back home. The comment landed like a grenade in the American press. Eisenhower was furious. Not the cold, controlled fury of Ohrdruf, but something sharper and more immediate. The fury of a man who has had his life's work publicly associated with a sentiment he found repugnant. He relieved Patton of command of the Third Army in October of 1945. Patton was reassigned to head the 15th Army, a largely administrative posting. He accepted it. He did not fight the decision publicly, which was itself unusual for a man who had fought almost every other significant decision made about his career with theatrical defiance. Perhaps he understood, in the private place behind the performance, that Eisenhower was right. Perhaps he was simply tired. He had been at war since 1942 in one form or another, and the exhaustion that combat generates is not the kind that rest entirely repairs. On December 9th, 1945, outside the city of Mannheim, the staff car carrying General George S. Patton was struck by a military truck at a railroad crossing. The collision was low speed. Nobody else in the vehicles was seriously injured, but Patton's neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21st, 1945, in a hospital in Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. He never faced the sustained public reckoning that his September statements about former Nazis might eventually have required. He never had to sit across from the historical judgment that Nuremberg was constructing in careful legal language. He died a war hero, and history largely preserved him at his most heroic, allowing the complicated and contradictory man of the autumn months to recede into a footnote that serious historians noted and popular memory quietly set aside. Eisenhower attended to his duties and did not speak extensively about Patton in public for a long time. What he thought in private about the loss of a man who was simultaneously his most valuable commander and his most persistent problem, he kept to himself. He was good at keeping things to himself. He was also good at making decisions in rooms that history would not immediately scrutinize. Because what happened next is the chapter of this story that nobody was eager to tell in 1946 or 1956 or even 1966. It was the chapter that had to be pried out of classified archives and declassified documents and the slow, reluctant process of a government acknowledging what it had done when the cameras were off, and the stated principles were colliding with the practical demands of a new kind of conflict. It was called Operation Paperclip. The name was bureaucratic and colorless, which was appropriate because what it described was a bureaucratic process conducted with colorless efficiency by people who had learned to separate the question of what something was from the question of what it could be used for. Beginning in 1946 and accelerating through 1947 and into the late 1940s, American military and intelligence agencies began systematically recruiting former German scientists, engineers, military officers, and intelligence operatives. The stated purpose was to prevent their expertise from falling into Soviet hands. The Cold War was not yet officially declared, but it was already the organizing reality of American strategic thinking. And in that reality, the most important calculation was not what a man had done in the previous decade, but what he could do in the next one. Wernher von Braun, who had used concentration camp slave labor to build the V-2 rockets that killed civilians across Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands, was given an American security clearance and put to work on the rocket program that would eventually carry Americans to the moon. Reinhard Gehlen, who had run Nazi Germany's intelligence operations on the Eastern Front and whose files were full of material gathered through methods that required no elaboration, was installed as the head of a West German intelligence organization funded and supported by the CIA. His network, built from the bones of the Nazi intelligence apparatus, became a foundational piece of Western intelligence infrastructure during the Cold War. These were not exceptions. They were the pattern. Some of the men whose salutes American soldiers had refused to return in the spring and summer of 1945, men who had arrived at American checkpoints in staff cars demanding to be treated as officers, men who had been put in crowded pens and handed shovels and looked through as if they did not exist. Some of those men were within 2 years receiving American government paychecks and American government protection. Eisenhower knew he was not a detail-free executive. He was not a man who signed papers without understanding what was in them. The broad contours of what American intelligence and military agencies were doing with former German personnel were not hidden from the men at the top. The full scope of Eisenhower's personal involvement in those decisions remains a matter of historical debate. What is not debated is that the program operated under his watch, that he did not stop it, and that the government he later led as the 34th President of the United States continued and expanded it. He made a different calculation, the same kind of calculation that Patton had made in Bavaria in September of 1945, the subordination of moral complexity to operational necessity, except that Eisenhower made it more carefully, more quietly, and with a more complete understanding of what he was doing and what it would eventually cost. The silence of 1945 said these men were not worth acknowledging. The silence of 1947 said something different. It said that what these men knew was worth more than what they had done. It said that the Cold War had created a new accounting system, one in which certain debts could be reclassified, certain records could be managed, and certain men could be moved from one column to another depending on the needs of the present moment. Both silences belong to Eisenhower. That is the part that does not resolve cleanly. That is the detail that refuses to let this story end with the cold room in Reims and the nod toward the door and the satisfying finality of justice delivered without sentiment. There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1945. In it, a senior German officer sits in the back of an American military transport, waiting to be moved to a processing facility. His uniform is complete, his medals are in place, his posture is correct, his face holds the expression of a man maintaining dignity through an experience he finds beneath him. Beside him, an American soldier sits with his rifle resting across his knees. He is looking out the window. He is not looking at the German officer. He is not performing contempt or anger or triumph. He is simply somewhere else in his mind, looking out at the German countryside rolling past, thinking about whatever a 20-year-old man from somewhere in America thinks about at the end of a long war when he is tired in every part of himself and the thing he has been fighting for is finally, technically, over. The German officer exists in that photograph. The American soldier exists in that photograph. But only one of them is present in the moment. That is what Eisenhower understood about the particular cruelty of indifference. Not hatred, not punishment, not the dramatic confrontation that the German generals had built their entire psychology around the expectation of receiving. Just the simple, devastating fact of not being seen, of being present in a room and registering as nothing, of raising your arm in a salute that was the physical expression of everything you believed yourself to be, and receiving in return not anger, not resistance, not even a visible decision to refuse, just the flat absence of acknowledgement, the continued scratching of a pen on paper, the continued gaze out a window, the continued everything of a world that had simply moved on and left you standing there with your arm in the air. The master race had been reduced to furniture, and that, Eisenhower had concluded, was the appropriate response to men who had built an empire on the premise that some human beings did not deserve to be acknowledged as human. Give them exactly what they gave. Alfred Jodl was executed at Nuremberg. His ashes were scattered in the Isar River near Munich. No grave, no marker, no ceremony. Hans-Georg von Friedeburg's remains were eventually reinterred in a naval cemetery in Germany. George Patton is buried at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the men of the Third Army he commanded by his own request. Dwight Eisenhower is buried in Abilene, Kansas, in the town where he was born, in a small chapel on the grounds of the presidential library that bears his name. The chapel is called the Place of Meditation. It is plain and quiet, no medals on the walls, no display cases of military hardware. Just the simple stone and the silence of a room designed for thinking rather than celebrating. He served as President of the United States for 8 years. He oversaw the expansion of the American intelligence apparatus that employed the men his soldiers had refused to salute. He warned in his farewell address in January of 1961 about the dangers of what he called the military-industrial complex. He knew what he was talking about because he had watched it being built, and he had made choices that contributed to its construction. And he understood better than almost anyone the gap between the principles of nation states and the decisions it makes when the principles become inconvenient. He was not a simple man. He was not a villain. He was not a hero in the uncomplicated sense that popular history prefers its heroes. He was a man of considerable intelligence and genuine moral seriousness who operated in conditions where moral seriousness and practical necessity did not always point in the same direction, and who made the choices available to him in the circumstances he actually faced rather than the cleaner circumstances that make for better stories. The order he gave in 1945 was right. The silence in the cold room at Reims was right. The walk through Ohrdruf was necessary, and the fury it produced was just, and the policy it generated was the correct response of a decent man to an indecent reality. What came after was more complicated. What came after is always more complicated. That is what this story is finally about. Not the salute that was refused, though that moment matters. Not the cold room in Reims, though that moment matters too. Not even Ohrdruf, though Ohrdruf is the hinge on which everything else turns. It is about the distance between the principle and the practice, between the cold, clear moment when a man looks at evil and names it correctly and refuses to extend it the courtesy of acknowledgement, and the longer, murkier years that follow when the same evil turns out to have skills and information and strategic value, and the accounting changes, and the silence that once meant justice begins to mean something else entirely. History gives us very few clean endings. It gave us Nuremberg. It gave us the gallows in the gymnasium at 1 in the morning. It gave us the image of Eisenhower standing behind his desk in a cold room, looking at 2 defeated men with eyes that communicated the full weight of what they had done, and asking them one question and nodding toward the door. Those moments were real. They happened. They meant what they appeared to mean, and then the next thing happened. And the thing after that, the men who were turned away came back in different forms, under different arrangements, through different doors. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough of them that the story cannot end at Reims without being incomplete. The question that Eisenhower left unanswered in his place of meditation in Abilene, the question that the gallows at Nuremberg did not fully resolve, the question that Paperclip made permanently uncomfortable, is the same question that this story leaves you with. When a man looks evil in the eye and turns his back, is that justice? Or is it only the beginning of a much longer and much harder conversation about what justice actually requires? The history says both. The history says it was right to turn away. The history also says that turning away was not enough. It was never going to be enough. And the men who built the camps knew that, which is why they built them the way they did, at scale, with paperwork, with administrative systems that could survive the removal of any individual and continue operating on the logic of the institution itself. You do not defeat that with a salute refused. You do not defeat it with a cold room and 60 seconds and a nod toward the door. You defeat it, if you defeat it at all, by doing the harder thing, the longer thing, the thing that does not fit in a single dramatic image or a single powerful moment of justice rendered in silence. You defeat it by remembering, not the way Eisenhower ordered his soldiers to remember at Ohrdruf, with cameras and documentation and the practical foresight of a man preparing evidence against future denial. But the way that changes what you build and how you build it and who you allow to walk back through the door and what you ask them to explain before you hand them a paycheck and a security clearance and a place in the architecture of the world you are constructing on the wreckage of the world they helped destroy. That kind of remembering is harder than a camera. It is harder than a gallows. It is harder than standing behind a desk in a cold room and looking at a defeated man without blinking. It is the hardest thing, and it is, in the end, the only thing that matters.